In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. My favourite nativity scene is a small painting by the 15th century Dutch painter Geertgen in the National Gallery. It shows the Christ child in the crib, totally luminous, so luminous that he lights up not only the faces of the figures peering over the crib, but the angels hovering above. And from that moment, that luminous light radiated outwards with ever-widening circles. And this is symbolized by the visit of the Magi from far lands, probably somewhere like Persia, following the star in order to kneel before the Christ child. And even as that gospel was written, the writer knew that that was coming true, because by the time the Gospels were written, the Christian faith was being preached all over the Mediterranean world. That light was radiating outwards in ever-widening circles. And there's a remarkable story to tell. Despite being illegal, despite very fierce, though spasmodic, persecution, culminating in the great persecution of the Emperor Diocletian in the year 300. By that year 300, the Christian faith had won the hearts and minds of a very significant majority in the Latin-speaking West and a majority in some parts of the Greek-speaking East. This without any kind of force, any kind of coercion, simply by word of mouth and example, it had won the hearts and minds of the Roman world. It's a remarkable story to tell. And it was indeed the people's religion. It became the ruler's religion only later. As I say, a remarkable story to tell. Now, this week I received an email from a distinguished figure who's been asked to be part of a small core group reflecting on a vision for the Church of England over the next decade. And he said to me, almost literally as a PS, what would your 3 points be, Richard, for a vision for our dear church, as he put it? Good question. What 3 points would you give as a vision for our church over the next decade? I'm only going to confine myself to one point, you'll be glad to hear. But I would want to begin by being realistic. Since the 18th century, the European mind has become more and more secularized. The 19th century saw some dramatic religious revivals, evangelical and Anglo-Catholic, which has had a continuing influence, both of them up to our present day. But even in the 19th century, there were vast swathes of the country that the church simply did not touch when people moved from the country to the industrial towns. And of course, since the 1960s, there has been a very, very dramatic decline, not only in church attendance, but even more significantly in the fact that there is now virtual total ignorance in our society of the main narrative of the Christian story. One thing that was really different about the time when I was a curate in the 1960s was that you could take it for granted that most people had some kind of familiarity with the Christian story. And of course we have to brace ourselves to the fact that as a result of COVID and the financial crisis ensuing from it, the next decade, or certainly the next few years, will be very difficult. You may have read very lurid stories in some of the papers about how the Church of England is going to be affected. Certainly It's lost already £40 million from collections and Christian giving from congregations, which of course is the money needed to pay the salaries and the pensions of the clergy. Now I say this not to depress us, not at all to depress us, but just so that we're realistic about the situation which is facing us. And my one point, I think, would be that in this time, all we need to do is retain a quiet confidence in the ultimate truth and beauty of the Christian faith. And we heard once again in the gospel this morning that great Christmas gospel, which we can never hear too many times, at the heart of our faith. In the beginning was the Word. And words are mysterious things, aren't they? How they're both once part of us. They're part of us when they go forth from us. And even when they go forth from us, they remain our words. No wonder the early Christians lighted upon this idea of trying to explain the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, at once fully God and yet going forth from God. And this image of the Word was a very, very rich one in that time. For Greeks, it meant the rationality of the universe, which is behind and beyond and within all things, which comes to consciousness in every human reason. And for the Hebrews, it was a wonderfully rich word. It meant the divine creative word which brought the universe into being in the first place, and which offers an ethical imperative to the prophets. Hugely rich idea. Now, when in the 4th century St. Augustine became a Christian, having followed a number of other religions before, he said that all those opening words of the gospel he had heard before, but what he had never ever come across before was, and the Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father. That was what struck him and took hold of his life and turned it upside down. But of course we don't just celebrate a fact in the fast, because those words of St. John's Gospel say that all this was simply that in order that all who believe in him might also become sons and daughters of God. If you like, the purpose of the incarnation was that we too should share in that intimate relationship with God, which Christ himself eternally enjoys. And the result of that, become more and more like God. The Eastern Church has this wonderful word, theosis, which will roughly translate divinization. We are to become like God, in the sense that we're to grow in love for God and one another, which is the very essence of God. What a wonderful story it is that we have to tell. And when Christians, in the light of that, read the Old Testament, you can imagine how their eyes lit up when they heard that first gospel reading, this first Old Testament reading today. Isaiah 60. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice. We can just imagine how thrilled they were by that passage, because they saw that being fulfilled in Jesus. That light was indeed going to go over the whole world, shining not only in our hearts, but ultimately upon all things. Now, one of the features of our time, of course, is that we have no prevailing philosophy in our society with which to relate. There's nothing like the Greek idea of the rationality in and all through all things, or the Hebrew idea of a great moral imperative behind things. We have to relate to a society which is almost entirely skeptical, reductive, and relativistic. And it's very difficult to relate these eternal truths to what is skeptical, reductive, and relativistic. And it may indeed be that the church does shrink somewhat. But there was a wonderful saying in the Diocese of Oxford, not invented by me, but one of my area bishops who had particular charge for very small rural churches. And one of his watchwords was, a small church is not a failed church. Look at some of the small churches in the world. Tiny, tiny church in Iran, for example. If you put your head above the border there, the parapet there, of course, you've had it. They're not a failed church. They're a succeeding church. They're witnessing there. Think of Christians in Pakistan who too often can be turned against and accused of blasphemy, which is, of course, a capital offence. They're not failed churches. They're witnessing in their situation. All that's called upon us to do is to witness in our situation with a quiet confidence in the truth and beauty of our faith. There's a passage in the letters of St. Peter, which I think is always worth returning to, where the writer says, in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that is within you, but do this with gentleness and respect. Are we able to give a reason for the hope which is within us? It doesn't mean being great philosophers. It just means asking ourselves, why is it, despite all questions, all doubts, there is something which holds me? There is something which makes a big difference to my life. What is that? Am I able to talk about it quite naturally to my children or grandchildren, to my friends or to my neighbours? Is it so much part of my being that, of course, it will come out in a quite natural way, as the writer says, in gentleness. Quiet confidence in the truth and beauty of the Christian faith. Whether the times are unpropitious, as T.S. Eliot said 80 years, whether they're propitious or unpropitious, it is that quiet confidence in the beauty and truth of our faith that I would be put forward as the first major indicator which we should hold on to over this next decade. In doing that, we can put our trust in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.